Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the history of thalidomide.
Yeah.
You've given me this video, and it really digs into how this drug went from like this miracle cure to like a symbol of pharmaceutical tragedy.
It definitely shows how scientific progress isn't always straightforward. Most people know about the birth defects from thalidomide, but they miss the nuance behind it, like how the same drug that caused such harm is now being used to treat serious diseases.
Oh, that's a big turnaround. So how did this all happen? Let's unpack this video and see what we find.
Okay, so the video starts off with the thalidomide disaster. Thousands of babies born with really bad birth defects. It sets the stage for just how much of an impact this drug had.
It really does. The video does a great job of capturing that. I mean, the way it talks about how thalidomide was developed in the 1950s and marketed as this safe and effective, sedative and anti-nausea medication, especially for pregnant women.
Yeah, and it was prescribed so widely, often without a prescription. It got popular really quickly. But back then, the idea that drugs could actually cross the placental barrier and harm the fetus, it wasn't widely understood.
The video even mentions doctors getting free samples to hand out.
Right. The whole pharmaceutical scene was different then. Research on how drugs affected pregnancy, it wasn't a big focus. And that obviously had tragic consequences.
So when did it become clear that something was seriously wrong with thalidomide?
It took about a year and a half after it became widely used for the consequences to become apparent. Babies were being born with all sorts of severe birth defects, like limb malformations, organ damage, even death, and the connection was undeniable. The type of birth defect was linked to the exact day the drug was taken during pregnancy.
That's terrifying. So precise. Like, what was the company's reaction? The company behind the drug? I mean,
At first, there was a lot of denial, but then as more evidence came out and doctors and families started speaking up, the company had to pull thalidomide from the market in 1961. But the damage was done.
this is where things get really interesting scientifically. The video explains that the thalidomide molecule has something called chirality. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Okay, imagine your hands. They're mirror images of each other, right? Well, in chemistry, molecules can exist in two forms that are mirror images called enantiomers. These enantiomers, even though they look similar, can have really different biological effects. And turns out the thalidomide that was being prescribed was a mix of both of these enantiomers.
So one version is helpful and the other is harmful, like a Jekyll and Hyde situation, but for molecules.
Exactly. And it turned out that one of these forms did have some benefits, but the other one was responsible for all those birth defects.
Wow. So they didn't even realize they were dealing with two different versions of the same molecule.
Not at the time, no. The whole understanding of chirality and what it means for drug development, that came after the thalidomide disaster.
So this one tragedy really changed the way we think about drugs.
It really did. It was a huge turning point. Now the video goes on to talk about America and Turkey. They pretty much avoided the disaster. Why do you think that was?
Well, in America, it was mostly thanks to Frances Kelsey. She was an FDA reviewer, and she just refused to approve thalidomide for sale in the U.S., even with all this pressure from the drug company.
She sounds like a hero.
She was. The video even mentions that even though thalidomide wasn't officially approved here, some samples were still given out, and that did result in a few birth defects. So imagine if she hadn't stood her ground, it would have been so much worse.
What about Turkey? How did they escape the disaster?
It seems like it was a few things. The country was slower to adopt new medications because of economic reasons. And then there were two Turkish scientists who raised concerns about thalidomide based on their own research. So it was like a perfect storm of caution and skepticism.
Interesting. So sometimes even unrelated things can work together to prevent a disaster. Right. And then there's this part of the video that I just couldn't believe. It says that thalidomide, the drug that caused all this suffering, is still being used today. How is that even possible?
Yeah, I was shocked by that too.
So more research showed that the good form of thalidomide, the one that wasn't harmful, actually had potential. It's now used under very strict regulations to treat things like leprosy and some types of cancer.
Wait, so it's not the exact same drug? They figured out how to separate the good from the bad.
They did. It's really amazing. It just goes to show how science is constantly changing. What we thought was purely bad can actually have a good side too. Of course, this doesn't erase the tragedy of what happened, but it does make the story even more complex.
It does. It really makes you think about all the medications we take today.
Yeah.
The research that goes into making sure they're safe.
Absolutely. And it also highlights how important it is to stay informed and really think critically about all of these scientific advancements.
That's a great point. Now, the video also goes into the aftermath of the disaster, like the company's response and the long-term changes to drug regulations. That's a really important part of this story. It sheds light on the accountability and the changes that came from this tragedy.
It really does, and I think it's crucial to understand how these things evolved. We should definitely delve into that further.
Let's do that.
Mm.
So did the company that made thalidomide face any consequences? Like, were they held responsible for what happened?
Well, the company Chemie Grunenthal, they faced a lot of scrutiny and legal action after the disaster. They never admitted they were at fault, but they did set up a compensation fund for the victims in a few countries.
Did the victims feel like that was enough? Like, was it fair?
Well, a lot of people felt like the compensation wasn't enough, and a lot of families kept fighting for more recognition and support. They felt like the company hadn't really acknowledged the extent of the harm they caused.
That makes sense. It must have been incredibly difficult for those families. What about the people who actually developed and marketed the drug? Did any individuals face consequences?
Unfortunately, not really. Very few individuals were held legally accountable for the thalidomide tragedy. The focus was mainly on the company itself. And while some executives did face criminal charges, most of them were acquitted or only got minor penalties.
So basically, they got away with it.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And this lack of individual accountability is a big issue for a lot of people. They argue that it shows a bigger problem within the pharmaceutical industry at the time.
That's a really important point. It's about more than just this one company or this one drug. So did all of this lead to any lasting changes in how drugs are developed and regulated? Like, did anything good come out of this awful situation?
Definitely. The thalidomide tragedy was a huge turning point for drug regulation around the world. It was a wake-up call, and it led to major reforms to try to prevent something like this from ever happening again. One of the biggest changes was stricter requirements for testing drugs before they even get to humans, especially when it comes to testing for potential birth defects.
So before thalidomide, they weren't really focused on testing for those specific harms.
That's right. That kind of testing wasn't standardized before the disaster. The thalidomide tragedy made everyone realize how crucial it is to understand how drugs might affect a developing fetus. So they created much more rigorous testing protocols to try to catch those risks early on.
So basically trying to identify any potential problems before a drug even gets close to a pregnant woman.
Exactly. And along with stricter animal testing, there was also a big shift towards doing more controlled clinical trials in humans, especially in pregnant women.
Why the focus on pregnant women specifically?
Well, the thalidomide disaster showed us that sometimes what happens in animals doesn't translate to humans, especially when it comes to pregnancy. So it became clear that to really understand if a drug is safe, especially for pregnant women and their babies, we need to go beyond just animal data and do more research with human subjects.
So they realized that the old way of doing things just wasn't good enough.
Exactly. They had to completely rethink how they approach drug safety.
It sounds like they overhauled the whole system, from the initial testing phases to the way they communicate information about potential risks to the public.
They did. The disaster forced a global reassessment of how we evaluate and manage risk in medicine. It led to stricter regulations, a greater emphasis on transparency, and more accountability throughout the entire drug development process.
It's amazing how much impact one drug can have on an entire industry.
It's true. And the impact of thalidomide continues to be felt today. It serves as a constant reminder of the importance of rigorous testing, careful monitoring, and responsible drug development practices.
It's a powerful reminder that scientific progress comes with great responsibility.
It does. And it also highlights the importance of vigilance and continuous learning in the pursuit of safe and effective treatments for all patients.
Yeah, it really was a total overhaul.
Yeah.
And another thing that changed after the thalidomide disaster was the way drug information is shared, like making sure people understand the risks.
Oh, yeah. The video mentions that. Like,
Yeah.
what specifically changed there? Well, the thalidomide tragedy really showed how important it is to have clear and accurate drug labeling, especially when it comes to risks during pregnancy. Before all this happened, that information wasn't always easy to find or understand, even for doctors.
So they had to make sure everyone involved was getting the right information, not
Yeah.
just doing the tests.
Exactly. So regulatory agencies started requiring drug companies to provide clear and complete information about all the potential risks and precautions and stuff.
Makes sense. So it seems like the thalidomide disaster basically changed how we think about drug safety, from the testing to the communication to the public.
It really did. It forced a global reassessment of how we evaluate and manage risk in medicine. So now we have more stringent regulations, a focus on transparency, and more accountability throughout the entire drug development process.
Okay, now let's get back to something we talked about earlier. America and Turkey both avoided this widespread tragedy. Can we look at that in more detail? What factors contributed to those countries being spared?
Sure. Let's start with the United States. Avoiding a large-scale thalidomide disaster here was largely thanks to Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey at the FDA.
That's the one we talked about earlier, right? The one who wouldn't approve the drug?
That's her. She insisted on rigorous testing, even though the drug company was putting a lot of pressure on her.
Wow, it's amazing how one person can make such a difference.
It shows how important it is to have strong regulatory systems and people who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. A small number of thalidomide-related birth defects did happen in the U.S. because some samples got out there. But the scale of the tragedy was minimized because of her.
What about Turkey? Why did they escape the worst of it?
Turkey's case is interesting. It was kind of a coincidence. Their adoption of new medications was a bit slower compared to other countries because of economic reasons, so that meant thalidomide wasn't immediately available there.
Oh, so they had some time to see what was happening in other places.
Right. It was lucky timing, I guess. But there's more to it. Two Turkish scientists, Professor Süreyya Tasan and Professor Şükrü Kaymakkalan, they raised concerns about thalidomide's safety, and that influenced the Turkish government's decision.
Can you remind me what those scientists did?
Professor Kaymakkalan was a pharmacologist. He had doubts about the drug's toxicity testing, and he wanted more safety evaluations. And then Professor Egan was a veterinarian. He did his own research on thalidomide using chicken embryos, and his research showed that the drug caused developmental abnormalities.
So they were both looking at the same problem from different perspectives.
Yeah, Professor Kaymakkalan was looking at the big picture of the testing, and Professor Egan was focused on how it specifically affected development. And together their work convinced the Turkish government to be cautious.
It's inspiring to see how they prevented a larger tragedy just by doing their jobs and caring about public health.
It really is. It shows how important scientists are in safeguarding public health. Now let's move on to something pretty mind-blowing. The video says that thalidomide, the drug that caused all this suffering, is still being used today. I don't get how that's possible.
I know. It seems crazy after everything we've talked about.
It's definitely one of the most remarkable parts of this story. So basically, research showed that the left-handed form of thalidomide, the one that doesn't cause birth defects, actually has therapeutic potential. They figured out how to separate the two forms, and now it's used to treat things like leprosy and some types of cancer.
So it's not exactly the same thalidomide. They've kind of purified it.
That's a good way to put it, and the applications are pretty incredible. One of the most important uses is in treating leprosy. Thalidomide is really effective at controlling the inflammation that comes with leprosy, so it really improves the quality of life for those patients.
It's almost poetic. A
Yeah.
drug that caused so much harm is now helping people with a serious disease.
It really is. It shows how complex science is and how things that seem purely harmful can actually have some good in them. But of course, using thalidomide today is super regulated. They're very careful with it because of its history.
The video also mentions thalidomide being used for cancer treatment. How does that work?
So thalidomide has this property called anti-angiogenesis. It can stop the growth of new blood vessels, and that's important for cancer because tumors need those blood vessels to grow and spread.
So it cuts off their supply lines.
Exactly. It basically starves the tumor. And that makes it a useful tool in treating certain types of cancer, like multiple myeloma. It's often used with other chemotherapy drugs to make them work better.
It's amazing how they figured out how to use this drug for good.
It shows the power of research and how important it is to keep looking for answers, even when a drug has a troubled past. Now, the video also gets into the aftermath of the disaster, the company's response, and the changes to drug development and regulation. We should talk about that more.
Yeah, let's do that. Did the company behind thalidomide face consequences for what happened?
Chemie Grunenthal, the company that made the drug, they got a lot of attention and legal action after the disaster. They never officially admitted they were at fault. But they did create a compensation fund for victims in some countries.
Do you think the compensation was fair? Was it enough?
A lot of people thought it wasn't enough. A lot of families kept fighting for more. They felt like the company didn't really understand how much damage they had caused.
It must have been so hard for them. What about the people who worked at the company? Did any individuals face any consequences?
Not really. Very few individuals faced any serious legal repercussions. Most of the legal action was aimed at the company itself. Some executives were charged with crimes, but most were acquitted or got off with pretty minor penalties.
So it seems like they got away with it.
Pretty much. And a lot of people are upset about that. They think it shows a bigger problem in the pharmaceutical industry back then. A lack of accountability.
That's an important point to consider. So did the thalidomide disaster lead to any lasting changes? Like in the way drugs are developed and regulated?
Absolutely. The thalidomide tragedy was a major turning point for drug regulation globally. It led to a lot of reforms aimed at preventing another disaster like this. One of the biggest changes was stricter requirements for testing new drugs in animals, especially when it comes to the potential for birth defects.
So before thalidomide, they weren't really focused on testing for those specific harms.
Right, that kind of testing wasn't standard practice. The thalidomide tragedy showed everyone how crucial it is to understand how a drug might affect a developing fetus. So they created much more rigorous testing protocols to try to catch those risks early on.
So they wanted to identify any potential problems before a drug even got close to a pregnant woman.
Exactly. And on top of the stricter animal testing, there was also a shift towards doing more controlled clinical trials in humans, especially in pregnant women.
Why the focus on pregnant women?
The thalidomide disaster showed us that testing on animals doesn't always give us the full picture, especially when it comes to pregnancy. They realized that to really understand if a drug is safe for pregnant women and their babies, we need to go beyond animal testing and do research with human subjects.
It sounds like they had to completely change their thinking about drug safety.
They did. The disaster forced the medical world to take a hard look at how they assess and manage risk, and that led to stricter regulations, a greater emphasis on transparency, and more accountability across the entire drug development process.
Yeah, it really is. So the thalidomide they use in medicine today, it's just the left-handed form. And research has shown that it can actually treat some diseases effectively without, causing those terrible birth defects.
So they figured out how to separate the good from the bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Scientists took this molecule with this horrible past, and through research and careful development, they were able to unlock its potential for good. Of course, thalidomide is very strictly regulated now because of what happened. So what kinds of conditions are they treating with this reformed thalidomide?
One of the most important uses is in treating leprosy. Leprosy is a chronic infectious disease, and it can cause some really serious problems like skin lesions and nerve damage. Thalidomide's really good at controlling the inflammation that comes with leprosy, so it can make a huge difference in a patient's life.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
A drug that caused so much suffering is now helping people with a serious disease.
It is. And it's not just leprosy. Thalidomide is also used to treat some types of cancer, especially multiple myeloma, but again, it's under very strict guidelines.
How does that work? How does it fight cancer?
Thalidomide has this unique property called anti-angiogenesis. Basically, it means it can stop new blood vessels from forming. And this is really important in cancer treatment because tumors need blood vessels to grow and spread.
So it's like cutting off their supply lines.
That's a good way to put it. It basically starves the tumor, and that's what makes it so valuable in treating certain cancers. It can be used on its own or with other treatments to make them more effective.
Wow. So this drug they once feared is now being used to fight cancer. That's incredible.
It shows you the power of research and how we can't give up on a molecule even when it has a really bad history. The thalidomide story is still unfolding. The video talks about how scientists are still exploring its potential.
What are they looking at?
They're looking at a bunch of different things, like inflammatory bowel disease, HIV/AIDS, and even some skin conditions.
So maybe thalidomide could help even more people in the future.
It's definitely possible. Researchers are working on new versions of the molecule, trying to make it even better and safer. It's really cutting-edge stuff.
It sounds like they're taking something with a really dark past and trying to turn it into something good.
That's a great way to think about it. They're taking this molecule with a really complex history and trying to unlock all of its potential for good while learning from the mistakes of the past.
I think this drug has taught us so much. It really shows that scientific progress is never ending, and there are always new things to learn.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is to be careful and to learn from our mistakes. The thalidomide story reminds us that scientific discoveries can be both good and bad, and we have to be really thoughtful about how we use this knowledge.
This has been a really amazing deep dive. It's been a story of tragedy and triumph, caution and innovation, and it's definitely shown the resilience of the human spirit and the power of science to make our lives better. Thanks for joining me today and exploring this fascinating and complex history of thalidomide with me.